Alrighty, everyone. Hello and welcome to our Not a Model Minority event today. I am super happy to be your moderator today, as you saw from our slides. I am Jordan Jusela, but a lot of people call me Joe over here, and I am coming to you guys on the behalf of course, Chandler-Gilbert Community College, but also the Asian Pacific Islander Club, because we are also so happy to announce that we are also sponsoring this amazing program on behalf of the college today. So again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us on this pretty bright, I'm already losing track of my days, but it is Wednesday. I almost forgot. But of course, I would love to introduce our guest speaker to you all today. We have Catherine Nakagawa. She is an associate professor of Asian Pacific American Studies in the School of Social Transformation. Her research explores issues of inequity in education, including the relationship between school reform, charter schools, family literacy programs, and racial literacy. She's also working on the Asian American and Pacific Islander Women's Health Project, which examines issues of sexual and reproductive health in AAPI, or Asian American Pacific Islander women, and the ways that personal stories, culture, family, and immigration influence health choices. Professor Nakagawa received her doctorate from Northwestern University in Human Development and Social Policy. She is doing so much, and I'm super honored to be her moderator today. But of course, before we continue, I would love to remind you all and encourage you guys to put your comments and questions in our chat box in our live YouTube broadcast, so that we can go ahead and read those and present those to our guest speaker later on in our Q&A section. But without further ado, I would love to kindly bring our attention to our speaker, Dr. Nakagawa, whenever you are ready to start.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you to everyone who invited me to be here today. I'm really honored to be the speaker for this. And thank you to everyone who's bringing this event together. I am actually coming to you from Central Phoenix, where I live, and I want to acknowledge the Akamel O'odham, Tohono O'odham, and Peeposh, the indigenous peoples of the land where I now live. The Know the Land project by the Lauer Student Group in Canada states the importance of land acknowledgements, and I'm going to read what they say. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. I also wanted to take a moment to remember the victims of the many acts of murder we've witnessed recently due to white supremacy, racism, sexism, and state violence. In particular, the incidents related to anti-Asian hate have likely hit close to home for many of you. And although this racism is not new, the more open hostility and violence directed at AAPIs is rising. So now, without further ado, I'll start my talk. Mike, if you don't mind bringing my presentation in. I titled today's talk, Not a Model Minority, to discuss the pervasive stereotypes that are used with Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and that contribute to anti-Asian sentiments. I should mention, though, that I'll be using this overall umbrella term, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and it is problematic in some ways, although it allows for a kind of political solidarity and a pan-ethnic, pan-Asian Pacific Island grouping, which does have more visibility. It's problematic because it tends to erase the diverse histories and backgrounds and wide differences that are between the many groups. So I acknowledge that, and I'm still going to be using this term throughout just as a shorthand. So when we think about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, you might think, you probably have an image that comes to mind. What do you think of? Or what do you think of? Is there a character that comes to mind first? Or some kind of costume maybe that comes to mind? It might be a doctor or somebody in technology. It might be someone dressed in, like I said, a kimono or a hula skirt. Maybe you thought of some festival you attended. And all of those are part of stereotypes that we might have and images that we've seen perpetuated in media over time that affect the ways that we think. So I'll be going through 3 prominent stereotypes, and we'll talk about some of the histories of those and some of the problems with each of those. So the first one I'm going to talk about is yellow peril. And yellow peril actually is related to and has a long history of this idea of Asians as being the enemy. And you can see some of the images and political cartoons that have been related to this. With the idea that Asians are the enemy, I wanted to share a little story that when I was in 5th grade, one of the first times we discussed Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, my friends started calling me spy. And I laughed along somewhat uncomfortably, but I had never thought about how I would be seen in a particular way as the enemy. Interestingly, this nickname stuck with me into high school, and I never really challenged it. I never thought about it. And it wasn't until later when I was studying Asian American studies that I thought about how this is related to this idea of yellow peril. So yellow peril's this long circulating representation about Asian Pacific Americans. It dates back actually to the 1800s. Along with this idea of an exotic land, this yellow peril trope casts Asia and the whole Pacific region as a site of threat due to aggression, disease, crime, and other imagined evils. It provided reasoning for the Page Act in 1875 that excluded Chinese women because they were supposed to be over hypersexualized and sites of disease, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and later other immigration acts that contributed to excluding Asians from many countries. And the site of this idea of yellow peril was when there was a lot of Chinese laborers were brought to the United States. They helped to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, but then the public began questioning how much immigration there was and these rising numbers of Chinese immigrants. And so through media primarily, this yellow peril idea gained social acceptance, and it fed into fears that people had about others, economic, social fears, xenophobic fears, fears of disease. You can see that it was perpetuated in these ways, and then every time there was some conflict overseas, it arose again. So during World War II, the yellow peril was directed at Japanese rather than Chinese Americans. And there were cartoonists such as Dr. Seuss, who was drawing images that reinforced the Japanese as a threat to safety. And today we see this, as you probably know, with the coronavirus. So this image is from when our former president was giving a speech and chose, instead of calling it the coronavirus, chose to cross it out and call it Chinese virus, or it's been referred to as Kung Flu. Or this is a headline from the Daily Wire: host announces he will begin calling coronavirus the yellow peril. So all of this has this long history, centuries old, of considering individuals from Asian countries and Pacific regions as threats. And what we see then today is that there is rising open hostility and hate and acts of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. This is an image from a graphic illustrator, a comic book artist, who has a series of images about the coronavirus, and this one says, "I am not a virus." And because of the rising incidence of hate crimes, there was an organization that started out of San Francisco State University called StopAPIHate, and they began tracking incidents of Asian American and Pacific Islanders that reported incidents of hate against them. And from when they opened this site to today, there have been over 2 million incidents reported. Dr. Russell Long is the person who started this, and a colleague of mine at ASU, Dr. Aggie Yellowhorse, has been very involved in analyzing the data. And Dr. Long is actually going to be giving a talk at ASU this Friday, and so I'll drop that link into the chat later. But he'll be talking on a panel with Dr. Yellowhorse and some other colleagues of mine at ASU if you want to attend that. I just wanted to give a little bit of the data that StopAPIHate has gathered so far. And this was just recently. So the question was, have you ever been a victim of a hate crime? Have you ever had someone verbally or physically abuse you or damage your property specifically because of your race or ethnicity? And you can see that both men and women have reported yes, both native-born and foreign-born have reported yes. And some of the highest incidents are of 18 to 34-year-olds, and then the older 65 and up. And other data has shown that younger individuals are less likely to report when they have experienced this because of fears about the police and how the police will react, that women worry more about facing a hate crime than do men. So if you want to explore more of this, please go to StopAAPIHate or AAPI data. There's summaries of this data out there. And then again, please come on Friday to hear more about this. So the second stereotype that I'll go over is called the Perpetual Foreigner. And you're probably very familiar with this one. It's tied to Yellow Peril. It's, again, all about treating others as different and not as Americans. When my youngest daughter was in 5th grade, she was waiting to get on a school bus at the end of the day, and a boy cut in front of her in line, and she said, "Hey, you're not supposed to do that." And he turned around and immediately said, "Why don't you go back to Japan?" So she was confused and hurt, and at the same time, she also strangely had this reaction that, "Oh, you recognize that I'm from Japan, my background's from Japan, not China," because the default is often go back to China, be Chinese. So there's this mix of emotions. And what we talked about later when she came home was that this is part of this big stereotype about being a perpetual foreigner. You'll see this a lot in the media. Gere Watanabe from 16 Candles is probably one that's very well known. But then you'll see the exaggerated costuming and buck tooth, like in the South Park image. Or you'll see the women dressed in hula scoops, like in the Elvis Presley. Part of this idea of perpetual foreigner is also put forward through this concept of yellow face. And yellow face is when individuals who are not of Asian descent act as Asian. They dress up as Asian. One of the most famous is Mickey Rooney from Breakfast at Tiffany's, where he was Mr. Yumiyoshi. There was Katharine Hepburn in a movie called Dragon Seed. And then more recently, you've seen Scarlett Johansson in Ghost in the Shell. And all of these images, what they do is they draw on concepts of mimicry and mockery in order to highlight what it means to be Asian. So this isn't based in reality, right? The Breakfast at Tiffany's image, but people begin to associate the bucktooth and the really thick glasses, the Coke bottle glasses, as Asian. What happens then, which is really interesting to me, there's a scholar named Edward Said, and Edward Said came up with the concept of Orientalism that some of you may be familiar with. And Said, again, traced how scholars and others wrote about and talked about the East and how it became the Orient and exotic. And with that, the images that were created by those who wrote about it, or the media who presented about what the East, what the Orient represented, became more real than actually the individuals who were from the Eastern countries, right? So here's a headline from a site where an actor talks about this. "I'm not an Asian stereotype, but I play one on TV." And they were trying to sort through in this essay about how in order to get cast, they almost had to play their own kind of yellow face. They had to take on these exaggerated Asian characteristics just to be recognized as Asian. You see this idea of perpetual foreigner also come through more in the news. So these are two headlines from 1988 and 2002 Winter Olympics. And the one from 1998, it was Michelle Kwan, if some of you remember, a fantastic figure skater. She was supposed to be the gold medal favorite. And Tara Lipinski, super young, ended up going, and she won the gold medal, and Michelle Kwan did not. So the headline that flashed up briefly on MSNBC was American beats out Kwan. And then somebody recognized that, wait, Michelle Kwan's American, and they took it down. So what's fascinating is that 2002, this happened again with Michelle Kwan. She was ended up getting the bronze medal, and her teammate Sarah Hughes took the gold medal. And the Seattle Times this time put up, American outshines Kwan. So when you stop to think about, like, would they ever have put that? Would they have put Lipinski, or American beats out Lipinski? It wouldn't have even entered their mind, except that Michelle Kwan was immediately thought of as not American. This perpetual foreigner plays out in other ways too. So in the 2018 Winter Olympics, Mirai Nagasu landed the first, triple, some big jump she landed. And Barry Weiss, a well-known writer for the New York Times, she tweeted out, "Immigrants, they get the job done," which is a play on Hamilton, if any of you have seen Hamilton. The problem was Nagasu was born in California, so her parents had come, they were immigrants, but she herself is not. So people pointed that out to Weiss, and Weiss was defensive and said, well, I'm just recognizing everyone, the immigrant heritage. But if she did that, she'd have to say that about everyone, right? Because nearly everyone who came to the United States is descended from immigrants. But she would not say that about nearly everyone. She chose to use that phrase with Nagasu. This connection, this implicit bias between being a perpetual foreigner, forever foreigner, and Asian is so strong that some of you might have heard of this, the implicit association test. So the implicit association test was created by researchers Tony Greenwald, Mazarin Banaji, and Brian Nosek. And it's a test that measures our unconscious, unrecognized connections that we make without even realizing it. So you might do it with women and being home, or with family and men being work. With Asians, the test that they created was to see if there was more of a connection between Asian American and foreign, and European American and American. And they found, this is a summary of the many people who did take that particular implicit association test. They found that about, it's not huge numbers, but there are more people who will are more likely to connect Asian American with foreign than European American with foreign. If you want to go and take the test, it's at implicit.harvard.edu, and you can see it. It tested a number of different ways, both with images and with phrases, and you're clicking both on your left and the right. So they're really trying to get at not that you're purposely doing something, but that implicitly, how fast do you make that connection without even thinking about it? So I think about this because, I was born here in Arizona. I'm actually a native Arizonan, but I've been asked, am I a foreign exchange student? Could I speak to people in Japanese? I speak English so well, and I'm sure many of you have heard these things too. And I remember when I was in first grade, we created these books all about me, and maybe some of you have created those books when you were in elementary school too. And one of the pages I was supposed to draw my favorite food. And I chose to draw a plate of sashimi, which was raw fish, as some of you know. And usually if my family had it, it was a real treat. And it was usually the tuna, the maguro. So it was pink. It was like little pink squares. And so I drew a plate with little pink squares on it. And because that was a favorite food, we rarely got it. And it was a real delicacy. And I showed my mom the book and that picture, and she got to it and she paused and she said, maybe you shouldn't list that as your favorite food. And she said, maybe kids won't understand what that is. And I know what she was thinking. She thought she didn't want me to be picked on. She didn't want me to fall into this perpetual foreigner idea. She was trying to lessen that perception of me as foreign. And she herself and my dad had both been imprisoned during World War II. Their families were incarcerated just for being of Japanese descent. And so I know that for her, it was very important for me to belong and to be seen and accepted by others. And so I did change the picture. I scribbled little circles around it and I made it look like strawberry ice cream. So, and I did like strawberry ice cream, but it wasn't my favorite food. But that's what I ended up doing for my book. So the third stereotype that I'm sure you're all very familiar with is the model minority stereotype. And this idea of the model minority was actually created in the 1960s by a writer, William Peterson. And he was writing about the Japanese Americans who were released from the imprisonment camps after World War II and were doing relatively well compared to other ethnic minority groups. And so he created this term model minority to talk about it. But, everything has to be contextualized, right? So as I told you about how my mom was really intent on having us fit in, and many immigrant families are like that, right? They don't want you to speak your native tongue. They want you to lessen your characteristics when you're out. Kids learn how to code switch, like when you're with your family, you're one way, and when you're out in public or at school, you're another way. What Peterson saw wasn't a success story, it was a coping mechanism. So Japanese Americans were released from the camps, and the last thing they wanted to do was still be seen as the enemy. So they did everything they could to fit in and to be seen as the model citizen. So it was a reaction and a response to having been oppressed and singled out during World War II. It's not something like special to the Japanese or the Asians at all. But this idea of model minority stuck, right? So you see this Time cover in 1987, those Asian American whiz kids. Well, again, it's a reaction to being an immigrant group. So many individuals, families came here and they knew that they had to, depending on the context that they were leaving from, they had to work very hard and their kids worked very hard. Or because of our many challenging immigration laws, the individuals that were let in were ones who had more education or had more resources. And so then their kids were more likely to be successful here. So this model minority is based on, it's just a construction, right? It's become more real, like with Orientalism, than the reality of what Asian Pacific Americans' experiences actually are. So many problems with this model minority myth. One being that, it's used often as this wedge between Asians and Blacks in particular, and you'll see anti-Blackness within Asian American communities. There's this wide disparity in which AAPI groups do well in school and particularly graduate from college, but it wipes those disparities out, and so oftentimes students don't get the attention or the resources that they need because they're looked at under this big umbrella, as I mentioned, and they're all seen as doing well. And then it not just creates this wedge with between Asians and Blacks, but with other ethnic minority groups too. So Asians are held up as, if they can do well, then why can't these other immigrant groups do well? And that is so problematic, and it feeds into this wider system of white supremacy, right? That those in power maintain power while the other groups are held up against each other. So there have been campaigns to fight against this idea of the model minority, and this was one. that was done a number of years ago, where people, and maybe some of you participated in this, right? They held up signs that said, "I am not your model minority," and this took place during Heritage Month in May. There have been attempts to really look at the different statistics that break down the model minority myth. So the Asian American population grew hugely. You know, we're one of the fastest growing ethnic minority populations in Arizona and across the United States, but they're not doing the best of any group. There's certain segments of them that they're doing very well, but not all portions of Asian American Pacific Islanders are doing well. Students sometimes are fearful of asking for help because they think, oh, I'm supposed to be part of this model minority myth, I'm supposed to be doing well. Or we'll see that teachers sometimes don't reach out to students because they assume that they're doing okay. And Asian American Pacific Islander students may not speak out. This was an article that came out in Time just recently, and it was written by Wynn, who is a terrific author. He talked about how Asian Americans are still caught in the trap of the model minority stereotype, and it creates inequality for all. And what he talks about in this is the ways in which Asian Americans often cling to, or they'll support this idea of the model minority because it helps them to feel more accepted, or they think they'll be more accepted, but that's not the case, right? So they think the model minority myth sometimes feeds into this idea of Asians as being honorary whites. They've become assimilated, they lose part of their cultural identity. There's this anti-Black subtext because it creates this comparison to other ethnic minority groups. It reinforces the idea of a meritocracy, that if you just work hard enough, you're going to do well. But does it create true acceptance is the question, right? So if you fulfill the model minority myth, are you really accepted, or is it just a facade? I would recommend to us to really think about that. So what does it do to an individual when you've been on the receiving end of these oppressive messages and representations, representations that you yourself didn't create, but that others are putting upon you? And what happens is, if those in power control how we see ourselves, then we really have internalized that racism. Then there's this wonderful book by the author Kathy Park Hong called Minor Feelings, and it just came out 2 years ago, I think 2019. And so she talks about that internalized racism. So she says how racial self-hatred is seeing yourself the way whites see you, which turns you into your own worst enemy. Your only defense is to be hard on yourself, which becomes compulsive, and therefore a comfort to peck yourself to death. So in this book, and it's a series of essays, and if you get a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. She goes through her own challenges, right? She is an immigrant. She suffered from depression. She worked really hard and became a poet, but she talked about how all the times she had to sort of swallow her feelings of how her experiences of racism weren't as bad as what other groups experienced. So that's why she called Minor Feelings. And she talks about specifically the model minority myth in the book, but also in a recent interview. And she says this: "It's like what Asian Americans live under is this kind of contract where as long as we behave and keep quiet and so forth, we're fine. The benefits of assimilation is that you're left alone. However, it's not the same as having any kind of power." And what all of this does together is a lot of concern over mental health. So the National Association of Mental Illness talked about this last year, about how Asian shame and stigma contribute to high rates of suicide among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it's a combination of stigma against going and receiving help, cultural pressures that immigrants often face, or individuals who are descended from immigrants face, where you have to live up to, or you have to help your parents, or your parents sacrificed a lot to get you here. And then the racism that you face in society of not being accepted as truly American in US society. So those three things in combination create this stress and this pressure. So what I want to say to all of you students is, if you're feeling that, I understand it. And I hope that you are getting support and resources you need. And at ASU, the students here, the Asian Pacific American Student Coalition has fought and asked for those kinds of resources, which aren't easily received. So we don't have really very many counselors who understand the Asian Pacific American experience and can provide that kind of support. But I hope that you're getting that kind of support, and I hope that Chandler-Gilbert Community Colleges is providing that, or that you students are able to access that. So please reach out to me or to others if you need support and resources. It's just a really hard time, and this combination of things you should understand is hard to juggle. And you might think like your parents had to go through harder things or others. It's not a competition and it's not a comparison. It's what you're experiencing yourself. And so please get the help if you need it, and please reach out and talk to others. So my next slide, let's see, is to kind of talk about resisting and challenging the stereotypes that you face. And one of the first things I always suggest to people is to really learn about the Arizona context. And so this is from 2010 census data, and I haven't seen all of the 2020 census data yet, but in 2010 in Arizona, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were the fastest growing ethnic minority group, even though we were still a small percentage of the overall population in Arizona. For less than 5% combined between Asian Pacific Americans, but still the fastest growing. So the population was growing. And I think that's still the case. We're growing quite quickly. And it's just really important, as I mentioned, I use that broad term, Asian Pacific Americans or Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But there are nearly 30 groups, specific ethnic groups, that make up this broad umbrella term that speak so many languages. So we just have to really be aware of the diversity within this broad umbrella term. And one of the problems, though, with being a small in number is that it's really hard to get data. So in the past, we've tried to collect data on how students are doing, and it's hard to tease it out. It took a long time for ASU even to differentiate between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. For a while, they put Pacific Islanders under Asian Americans, and then they put Pacific Islanders under the generic other, and then finally they broke them out so that we could see specifically how students were doing. Just for your own awareness, you might know, though, Chandler-Gilbert student demographics from 2019, the most recent one I could find. The Asian American, Native Hawaiians, you can see 5.88% are Asian American, and less than 0.5% are Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. So some questions to ask about representations and stereotypes is really to figure out how they're created, like we talked about the historical context for these things. How do they gain social acceptance? Like, who's accepting this and for what purpose are they being accepted? How do they circulate? Where are they circulating? And overall, then usually it's a political purpose or an economic purpose that's being served by these representations and stereotypes. So when you start to ask these questions, you really begin to think about these counter narratives and alternative representations. And Mike, if you'll play this video.
I'm Asian, but I'm not quiet.
I'm Asian, but I'm not in the medical field.
I'm Asian, but I'm over 6 feet tall.
I'm Asian, but most people think I'm Latina.
I am Asian, but I can't play piano. Actually, that's a lie. I play piano a little bit, but I suck at it.
I'm Asian, but I don't like anime.
But I'm not submissive.
But I'm from Kansas.
But I'm a great driver.
But I'm very bad with my money.
But I am 5th generation.
But I don't speak with an accent.
I'm Asian, but I'm not Chinese.
We're not all actually Chinese, just so you guys know.
I'm Asian, and I play music for a living.
I'm Asian, and I'm Hispanic.
I'm Asian, and I'm a professional cyclist.
I'm Asian, and I'm a ladies' man. That's my move at the club.
I'm Asian, and I love Mexican food.
I'm Asian, and I'm also an LGBT activist.
And I'm an extrovert.
And I love hockey.
And I love talking about my feelings with my parents.
And I went to theater club in college.
And I don't necessarily look Asian.
I am Asian, and I do love rice. I really do. I love it so much.
I'm Asian and American.
I'm Asian, and I love it.
I'm Asian, and I'm comfortable in my own skin.
Thanks, Mike. So I always try to get students to expand representations in different ways, take the opportunities, if you can, to take ethnic studies classes, Asian Pacific American studies classes. Really think about what's presented to you. I know that in our US history classes, we often don't hear very much about, or anything maybe about, the Asian Pacific American experience. So that's something that students often have to ask for. Sometimes we need these spaces to explore and rewrite dominant narratives. And so I really appreciate your club that you have. I think that's one of those kinds of spaces where you can explore and rewrite and counter the dominant narratives that we have in society. So this image actually is from a book that some students put together at another college, where they talked about their own experiences and then they had someone who illustrated them. And so it was a really good way for them to talk with others about that experience of being a perpetual foreigner or of being othered in some kind of way. A number of years ago, we did at ASU a state of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Arizona. And I love this image because it shows people from all across Arizona in all different situations and jobs, of all different ethnic backgrounds. And they just represented the diversity of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Arizona. And the report talked a little bit about history, it talked about educational examples, it talked about first responders, health. It also talked about the cultural festivals that are the way that many of us come together. Because our communities are small in number, sometimes the way we gather is through the bigger festivals that we have. This is just a picture of my dad, and he passed away in January. And I wanted to show this because his history is part of the history of Phoenix. If any of you drive along Baseline Road at the foot of South Mountain, there used to be these fields and fields of flowers. And this is right close to 40th Street and Baseline Road. And this is what it used to look like. So my dad's family and 6 other Japanese American families used to grow flowers along Baseline Road throughout the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s into the 1990s. They were still growing. And it was a huge tourist attraction. Baseline at that point was a 2-lane highway. And so I took this for granted growing up as a kid, and I didn't think about the ways that my family and the other Japanese American families, what they did after they were released from the camps was they farmed, and they ended up making this beautiful area of Phoenix that Phoenix then touted as a tourist attraction. And you could see it in Arizona Highways magazines and things like that. So the flower fields are not there anymore, but my family's flower shop is still there. And we're hoping to keep it going. It's been going since the 1950s. So we're hoping to keep it going a little while longer. So if you get a chance, stop in. I might be there hanging out and you can say hi. And then the Asian American Pacific Islander community here has really been coming together a lot. And this is a picture from the recent march that took place in Mesa to talk about, or to raise attention about anti-Asian hate, and it took place just after the Atlanta murders. And what was important about this was the different communities that came together, and it wasn't just Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Other groups were there with us as allies. And I think the other piece that was important was the recognition of the violence against Asian Americans, Asian American women, and Asian American sex workers. So the intersection of those was important also and brought up at this particular rally. And I think there's another Unity March scheduled for this Saturday, the 24th, at Hance Park or Still Indian School Park. But look for that, and I'll try to find the link and send that to you too. I always talk about one of the other things that's important in helping us all to fight the stereotypes and to help society as a whole is that we have to become more racially literate. And when we think about what literacy is, it's learning how to communicate and to write and to read. And so racial literacy is developing this aspect of knowing how to write and talk about and think about race. And a lot of people feel so uncomfortable with it. So this term came from France Wittgenstein, who's a sociologist, and she first wrote about it when she did interviews with mothers, white mothers, who were raising biracial kids in Britain. And so she talked about it as this form of racial socialization and anti-racist training. And what she said is that these white mothers really had to learn this racial literacy in order to properly raise their biracial children in a society that primarily saw the children as Black. Howard Stevenson has also used this term, and he talks about it specifically in relationship to schools. And he uses some aspects of the racial socialization framework that Twine talks about, but also he has very specific suggestions for what schools need to do. So he says, you know, being racially literate is being able to read race, that means understand race, recast, and I'll tell you what that acronym means in a minute, and then resolve racially stressful social interactions. So what Stevenson recognizes that a lot of times teachers and students will see or hear something that's racist, and rather than respond to it and interact about it, they will ignore it because they don't know how to. And it's so stressful that they would just rather ignore it and not address it, which then leads to this belief that it's okay to act that way. And that's not what should happen. We need to address it. So this is what Recast stands for Stevenson: Racial Encounter, Coping, Appraisal, and Socialization Theory. So when you see a racist act, you have to recognize it. You have to acknowledge the stress and discuss it with someone, and then you have to practice ways of addressing racism. And it's really hard to do with all of us. Even when you yourself face a racist act or are called something, it's hard to address it. I know I've been in situations where someone said something, and it's hard to know whether I should address it in the public group or whether I should take the person's side later. So you practice different ways of addressing it, and it gets easier and it gets better, and it helps when others are there to support you. And usually when you say something, there are others who recognize it too and will also support you. So becoming racially literate is hard work. It does require self-reflection. It means you're going to engage in hard and awkward conversations. And I know last summer and even throughout the year, many Asian families or students were engaging with their own families about the anti-Blackness that they often heard exhibited and the racism that they heard in their own families toward Black Americans. And those were hard and awkward conversations, but they often opened up opportunities to talk about other things. being aware of and responding to racist acts, and then recognizing racism as a structural issue. So it's not individual. Individuals enact it, and we see it happen with individuals, but it's definitely a structural issue. So it shouldn't come down to, that's just a problem with the individual. When things like this happen, it's a problem with the way that the structure is set up, and we have to change all parts. But we can start with, right now, our own reactions to things. And this is where we challenge implicit bias. And Mike, if you can play this video, please.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Thanks, Mike. What you'll often see with those implicit biases is that they're related to a term you're probably familiar with also, the microaggressions, racial microinvalidations. It's a concept that was created to acknowledge the small ways that racism comes up. So we talked about some of these. No, where are you really from? What are you? You're not like other people, Black people I know. So these terms, these phrases, just reinforce the idea that what you're feeling isn't very important or they're not really racist. And so that minor feelings idea that Hong talked about is one of the ways that microaggressions and racial microaggressions are just reinforced, and that we again then tend to internalize that racism. So sometimes it's hard to do, but you want to try to recognize those micro insults, micro assaults, and invalidations. And Sue talks about these things. He talks about how we'll see these themes in terms of criminality, alien in our own land. People will say they'll just not even recognize race, denial that they individually are racist, and then the idea that if people worked hard enough, then it would be okay. It's nothing to do with the systemic racism. And hearing that over and over again leads to that feeling that, well, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe, you've heard the term gaslighting. Maybe I didn't hear that right. You start to doubt yourself. You don't feel like you're part of others if you're the only one hearing those kinds of things. And that's how it starts to prey on your self-esteem and your mental health. And those are the things you need to recognize that, no, what you're feeling is actually happening, and you should talk to others about it because they will have experienced that too. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. And these are just some hashtags that I know have been around in other AAPI Heritage Months. So not your Asian sidekick, not your costume, whitewashed out, praising the Asian. This was, the picture here is from a public announcement or ad to try to counter these stereotypes, stand up against racial stereotypes. And so I wanted to end with two quotes. One is from Jeff Chang, his book on race and race segregation called We Can Be All Right. And he talks about at the end, the horizon toward which we move always recedes before us. The revolution is never complete, but redemption is out there for us if we are always in the process of finding love and grace. And then the other thing I wanted to end with is a poem by Ha-Jin. It's called A Center. You must hold your quiet center, where you do what only you can do. If others call you a maniac or a fool, just let them wag their tongues. If some praise your perseverance, don't feel too happy about it. Only solitude is a lasting friend. You must hold your distant center. Don't move even if earth and heaven quake. If others think you are insignificant, that's because you haven't held on long enough. As long as you stay put year after year, eventually you will find a world beginning to revolve around you. That's what I'm thinking. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing and the world's going to come along. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakagawa. The comment section has been rolling with comments all about your presentation, and I'm very happy to have witnessed it because, of course, it is very, very timely. But, of course, we do have some comments and questions for you already. So first question we have today is, if the COVID-19 pandemic didn't happen, do you think hate crimes towards AAPI individuals would have still increased?
That's if COVID, I don't know that, because definitely they did increase because of the pandemic and the ways that politicians framed the pandemic. So, if there were still economic problems, because that's when we also see the hate crimes and things increase. We've seen that in other times when the U.S. has been going through difficult economic times, and then they look for a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is usually a marginalized group. So if it hadn't been the pandemic, maybe it would have been something else, and we might have seen the increase.
Right. Thank you very much for answering our question. All right, number 2. Oh, and before moving on, if you guys still have any other questions or comments, please do not hesitate to drop them in our live comment section, and we will be sure to get to them shortly. Okay, question number 2, Dr. Nakagawa, what is the name of your flower shop? # support local businesses.
Thank you, support local businesses. It's called Baseline Flowers, and it's just west of 40th Street on Baseline Road. And actually, if you stop, there's a Circle K right at the corner of 40th Street and Baseline. And there's a kind of kiosk display there that tells the history of the area.
Oh, I'll be sure to try and stop by. I would love to see that. All right. We also had a comment. In Japanese culture, patience is a virtue. That's how I was raised in Japan. Speaking up is a challenge for me, yet I force myself to do so here in America. So do you have any advice for speaking up?
I will say that I'm third generation. So my grandparents came from Japan, and I have always had a hard time speaking up too, because it's not just that patience, but it's also that not speaking back to others, I think, is also part of what I was taught. So it really is just practicing. So I appreciate that Ken's like, I forced myself to do so. That's what I had to do. I had to, in school, force myself to ask a question or force myself to interact with somebody whose opinion I didn't agree with. And I can't say that I think I'm still practicing it, even though it gets a little bit easier as I get older, because I think I've done it a little bit more. But it's still hard. And I know what it feels like. It feels like, oh my gosh, I have to speak up now. And this is why microracial aggressions are so hard. It's because you see this happening, you recognize it, and then you feel like I have to speak up, and your body gets stressed, right? You start perspiring and you're thinking like, what am I going to say? And what's going to happen if this person reacts? And then if you don't say something, then you beat yourself up over that too. So you think about that whole context of stress that you put yourself under, and somebody else doesn't even recognize that that's an issue. So I would just say, keep practicing, Ken, and it'll get, I hope, easier.
Right. I mean, we have to keep going. It's all through experience, right, on how we can improve ourselves. Thank you for answering the question. Okay, next one we have, how can we continually keep ourselves more aware and participate in events that support the AAPI community?
Oh, good question. There are a number of groups you can follow on Facebook that have that usually try to post about these kinds of things. There's some organizations that I've been involved in. Asian Pacific Community in Action is one that does a pretty good job of posting or highlighting. There's a coalition of Asian American Pacific Islander groups called Arizona AAPIs for Equity Coalition, and they have a Facebook and an Instagram, and they often post about events also. And then the Arizona Asian American Chamber does a pretty good job also of highlighting events that are happening.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, question number 4 we have, how can we respond in a way that is mature and kind when faced with racism remarks? How can we remain calm in those situations? I would love to hear about this.
This is a good question. I like that idea of mature and kind when faced with racism remarks. And so it depends a little bit on the context. So I always try to treat it as an opportunity for learning. So when I think about racial literacy, I think about how I wouldn't get upset with somebody who didn't know how to read a word or read a passage of something. And so maybe with racism, there's the overt racism where they really are trying to say something, but sometimes there's the unintended racism where they don't know what they just said was racist. And so then it's an opportunity to educate and to help someone become a little bit more racially literate. And that's what I think of it as. And so that's where I said, do you do it in a public setting or do you do it in private? So for example, I teach, and depending on the context of when the student says something, I will address it generally in class, and then I might address it just individually with the student to ensure that they understood that when I generally made this statement about that's not appropriate, they understood that it was specifically also addressed to them as an individual. So sometimes that's a good way in groups also to respond, is somebody says something, and then you can wait a little bit and then maybe say, sometimes people say these things and it's interpreted this way, or you might not know that this is what it means. And so if you do it as an opportunity to educate, I think that can be kind of helpful.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm sure we can use that advice when we are faced with those types of situations in the future. We actually have a comment from somebody that just came in. Casey said, I have a difficult time when people make comments that are hurtful. If anything, their response is either, it was just a joke, or it's funny, or why are you so sensitive? So I hope that the advice from our Dr. Nakagawa was able to help you with that. Did you have any other comments that you'd like to add on to that?
Yes, that's exactly an example of those micro invalidations, and that they're trying to make you feel like, oh, you didn't, Casey, that's exactly that example. Great example. That's exactly what happens with those. And for one thing, it's their problem, not yours. So remember that. But the way to, it's hard to respond because if other people just laugh or it makes other people feel uncomfortable, that puts you in a really difficult position. But, I think it's important also just to say, because I've done that too, I've said, well, it wasn't funny to me. And so, just remember that in the future, and then move on. So.
Right. Moving on, which is difficult, but we got to do it. Thank you very much for that. All right. Question here we have, any more specific suggestions for one or two things that people from the dominant white culture can do to help improve things?
I think that it's really important to be a good ally in different ways. So not to speak for somebody, but to support them when they are speaking. So like if Casey were in that situation and she said, that was kind of wrong, I think it would be good for John then to say, yeah, I thought that was kind of, so to support what Casey is saying. Or later on, like when sometimes in some of my classes, I talk about this, about what you do as a bystander when you witness something that happens. And you want to check with the individual themselves to make sure that they're okay, to let them know that I saw that thing happen. I recognize it. I want to support you. What do you need from me? And I think those are things that you can do. So check about the person who experienced the racism. And then for others to really educate yourselves, like to learn. I know, unfortunately, we learned so little about Asian American Pacific Islander history and those histories that were important in U.S. history. So having the opportunity to do that would be terrific. And the PBS recently had a series, right, last year, about that you can look up and had a good overall overview of the history.
Awesome. Yeah, right now more than ever, I feel like it's very important that people immerse themselves into becoming more aware in what's going on in other like AAPI communities, like, even the Black culture that's going on. I think if we could all just equally participate in everything as best as we can, then, it'll just spread more love. Thank you for sharing that. We have another comment that just rolled in. What can I do as a future psychologist to help with the mental health of the AAPI community? That's a good question.
That is. Thank you. Thank you, Mia, for that question. There is, within the Asian or the American Psychological Association, there's a AAPI special interest group, and they have a lot of resources there. I think it's really important, and this has been a challenge in, I know, training, whether there's good training for individuals that allows for cultural competency. And so I think pushing for those kinds of things in programs is very important. I think also if you can talk to, and there's not a lot because I know it's not a huge group, but if you can talk to other psychologists who do work with the AAPI community, that they can help you to figure out the best strategies. So, one of the things that was interesting at ASU that we had was when the counseling center was hiring, they did hire somebody of Asian descent, but they were of Asian immigrant descent, which was a little bit different than being of Asian American descent. And so sometimes it was that there was a disconnect for the Asian American students who were facing certain things that the counselor didn't recognize. And so even though their backgrounds had some similarities, there was still a disconnect there that the students had to ask for people who really understood an Asian American experience as opposed to just being of Asian background.
Gotcha. I hope more people of Asian descent are found as psychologists in the future. So good luck, Mia. I hope you find the sources that you're looking for. And thank you, Kathy, for answering that. That does seem to be our final question. Dr. Nakagawa, thank you so much for giving us your amazing insight on your topic today, not a model minority. Of course, since it is super timely, I'm very happy that we were able to have an event like this, and of course with such an amazing speaker with us today. But Yeah, thank you so much again for joining us, everyone, in our live chat and our live YouTube broadcast. Continue to try and stay up with everything that's going on in our AAPI community. But I hope everyone enjoyed participating just as much as I did. Dr. Nakagawa, do you have anything else to part us with today?
No, I was gonna really quick, if you give me a second, I'll drop in the link to the talk that's on Friday for those of you who might want to join and watch the panel on Stop AAPI Hate. Let me see if I can do that real fast, if you don't mind. And Joe, I just wanted to say what a great job you did. You were terrific. Oh, can I make a comment here? I don't know if I can.
If you do in our chat, I can go ahead and paste it in the YouTube comments.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do that. All right.
Also, again, shout out. Don't forget, it is also pinned in our live YouTube chat to take note of your guys' attendance with the link provided. So make sure all of you students here today to make sure your guys' attendance is counted. I'm going ahead to drop the link that Dr. Nakagawa just put in for us for the panel upcoming. Just give me a second, guys. Alrighty. And pasting it in right now. Go ahead and copy that link and save it and put it in your guys' calendar. And hopefully we can bring more people through that event as well. Again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Thank you so much.
You did a great job.
Of course.
Thanks. Bye.
Happy Wednesday, guys. Bye.